Emily's heart raced as she walked through the glossy doors of Parker Publishing. After years of working at smaller companies, she had finally landed a job at one of the biggest names in the industry. At 28, she felt this was her chance to prove herself. The modern office buzzed with activity, people moving with purpose between glass-walled meeting rooms. "You must be Emily," a woman with a sleek bob and sharp eyes said. "I'm Diane, Mr. Thompson's assistant. He's expecting you." Emily smoothed her skirt and followed Diane down a long hallway. Everyone they passed seemed to straighten up when they saw Diane, which only made Emily more nervous about meeting the man she would be working for. Robert Thompson was a legend in publishing. At 60, he had worked with some of the biggest authors and had a reputation for turning failing projects into bestsellers. He was also known for being tough, demanding, and impossible to please. "Wait here," Diane said, gesturing to a chair outside a large corner office. "He'll call you in when he's ready." Emily sat, clutching her portfolio. Through the glass walls, she could see Robert speaking on the phone. He was tall with silver hair and wore a perfectly tailored suit. His face was serious, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested years of concentration rather than laughter. 20 minutes later, Diane's phone buzzed. "You can go in now," she said without looking up. Emily took a deep breath and opened the door. The office was spacious, with one wall entirely made of windows overlooking the city. Robert Thompson stood behind his desk, his back to her as he looked out at the view. "So you're the new talent everyone's been talking about," he said, turning to face her. His voice was deep and smooth, with a hint of roughness that sent an unexpected shiver down Emily's spine. "Emily Watson, sir. It's an honor to meet you," she said, extending her hand. Robert looked at her hand for a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, his hand warm and dry against hers. "Honor has nothing to do with it. You're here because your portfolio showed promise. Whether that promise turns into anything worthwhile remains to be seen." Over the next few weeks, Emily worked harder than she ever had before. Robert set impossible deadlines, rejected her ideas without explanation, and expected her to read his mind. Yet each time she met his demands, he simply nodded and gave her more work. The office became like a second home. Emily often stayed late, determined to prove herself. One evening, as the office emptied and the lights dimmed to their automatic nighttime setting, Emily was still at her desk, reworking a proposal Robert had torn apart that morning. "Still here?" Robert's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway of the open office space, his tie loosened and jacket gone. "Just finishing up the Wilson proposal," Emily said, trying to hide her exhaustion. Robert walked over and looked at her screen. He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something woody and expensive. "You've been here since 7 this morning. The proposal can wait until tomorrow." "I want to get it right," Emily said. Something changed in Robert's expression. For a moment he looked almost impressed. "Come with me," he said. Emily followed him to his office, wondering what new task he would give her. Inside, he closed the door and motioned for her to sit. Instead of going behind his desk, he sat in the chair next to hers. "You've been pushing yourself too hard," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I want to do a good job," Emily replied. "Why publishing?" he asked suddenly. "It's a dying industry according to some. Why Mac Tech or something with better hours and pay?" The question caught her off guard. It was the first personal thing he had asked her. "I believe books matter," she said honestly. "They changed my life growing up. I want to be part of bringing stories to people who need them." Robert looked at her for a long moment. The office was quiet, the rest of the floor dark. For the first time, Emily noticed how blue his eyes were behind his glasses. "Have you eaten?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "Neither have I." He stood up and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I usually don't do this with employees," he said as he poured, "but you're not like most employees I've had." Emily took the glass he offered, their fingers brushing briefly. The touch sent warmth through her hand and up her arm. "To hard work," Robert said, raising his glass. "To hard work," Emily echoed, taking a sip. The wine was rich and complex, probably worth more than she made in a day. The next morning, Emily arrived at the office earlier than usual. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the evening with Robert over and over. The way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, the brief touch of his hand on her arm. These moments felt important in ways she couldn't explain. When she reached her desk, she found a note with her name written in strong, slanted handwriting. My office, 9 a.m. Bring coffee. 2 black. It wasn't signed, but she knew who it was from. At precisely 9, Emily knocked on Robert's door, balancing 2 cups of coffee from the expensive shop across the street. Come in, his deep voice called. Robert was standing by the window again, looking out at the city. He turned when she entered, and Emily was struck by how rested he looked despite their late night. His silver hair caught the morning light, and the lines around his eyes crinkled slightly when he saw her. Good morning, she said, setting 1 coffee on his desk. Thank you. He took a sip and nodded approvingly. I have a new project for you, something different. He explained that one of their best authors was struggling with her latest manuscript. The book was due in 3 months, but the writer was blocked. I want you to work with her directly, help her find her story again. Emily couldn't believe it. This was a job usually given to senior editors, not someone who had been there less than a month. Are you sure I'm ready for this? Robert looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't sure. For the next 2 weeks, Emily split her time between her regular duties and working with the author, a woman named Lisa who had written 5 bestsellers. The project was challenging but exciting. Each evening, Emily would update Robert on her progress. These evening meetings became a ritual. They would start with work talk, but as the night grew later, the conversation would shift to books they loved, places they'd traveled, dreams they had. Robert began ordering dinner for them when they worked past 7, and they would eat at the small conference table in his office. One night, as they were discussing a particularly difficult chapter in Lisa's book, Robert loosened his tie and sighed. Sometimes I miss being a writer myself, he admitted. Before I became an editor. You wrote? Emily asked, surprised. Robert nodded. Nothing published. Just for myself. What did you write about? He looked at her for a long moment. Love. Loss. The usual subjects that haunt a young man. Emily tried to imagine Robert as a young man, passionate about writing, and felt a strange tug in her chest. I'd like to read something of yours someday, she said softly. Perhaps. His voice was quiet. Though I warn you, it's not very good. I doubt that, Emily said. Their eyes met across the table. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that had been building for weeks. Robert was the first to look away. It's getting late, he said, standing. I should let you go home. But Emily didn't want to go. The thought of her empty apartment held little appeal compared to the warm, book-lined office and Robert's company. Actually, she said boldly, I brought something I thought you might like to see. She pulled a folder from her bag. It's a short story I wrote in college, since you shared about your writing. Robert's expression softened. I'd be honored to read it. They moved to the leather couch in the corner of his office. As Robert read, Emily watched his face, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, how his lips moved slightly with certain phrases. This is good, he said when he finished. Very good, actually. Thank you, Emily said, feeling herself blush. You have talent, he continued, not just as an editor. Their shoulders were touching on the couch, and neither moved away. The office was silent except for the distant hum of the cleaning crew's vacuum. Emily, Robert said, his voice lower than usual. I find myself thinking about you far more than is appropriate. Her heart raced. I think about you too, she admitted. Robert turned to face her. His hand moved slowly, giving her time to pull away, and then gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch lingered on her cheek. This is complicated, he whispered. I'm your boss. I'm older than you. There are a dozen reasons why this is a bad idea. I know, Emily said, but she leaned slightly into his touch. His eyes searched hers, looking for doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened. Emily felt herself respond, her hand moving to his chest, feeling his heart beating as rapidly as her own. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing heavily. Robert's eyes were darker, intense with a hunger she hadn't seen before. The next morning, Emily woke with her mind spinning. Last night with Robert had changed everything. After those intense kisses on his office couch, they had pulled apart, both breathless and surprised by their own actions. Robert had called her a cab, insisting she get home safely, though his lingering touch on her hand as she left told her he wanted her to stay. At the office, Emily kept her head down, unsure how to act. Would Robert pretend nothing happened? Would he be cold? She couldn't focus on her work, checking the time every few minutes. Around noon, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Dinner tonight? My place. We need to talk." Emily's stomach flipped. His place, not the office. She texted back a simple yes before she could overthink it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Robert was in meetings, and they only saw each other once in the hallway. His eyes met hers briefly, intense and full of unspoken words, before he continued walking with the board members beside him. That evening, Emily stood outside an elegant brownstone in a neighborhood she could never afford. She had changed after work, putting on a simple black dress that she hoped looked sophisticated rather than trying too hard. Robert opened the door before she could knock. He had changed too, wearing dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that made him look younger and more relaxed than his office suits. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Emily asked as she stepped inside. His home was beautiful, warm wood floors, walls lined with bookshelves, art that wasn't flashy but clearly valuable. It felt like him, tasteful, cultured, with nothing to prove. "Wine," he offered, leading her to a living room where soft jazz played from hidden speakers. "Please." As he poured, Emily noticed his hands were less steady than usual. Robert Thompson, who commanded rooms full of executives without blinking, was nervous. He handed her a glass and sat beside her on the sofa, close but not touching. "Emily, about last night." "Do you regret it?" she asked directly, her heart pounding. Robert looked at her, his blue eyes serious. "I should. You're half my age. I'm your boss. This could ruin your career before it even starts." "That's not what I asked," Emily said softly. He took a deep breath. "No, I don't regret it. That's the problem." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "I've never crossed this line before. Not in 30 years of publishing." Emily squeezed his hand. "I'm not asking for promises. I feel something when I'm with you, something real." Robert's free hand moved to her face, tracing her cheek with a gentleness that made her shiver. "I feel it too. But I need you to understand what you're getting into. People will talk. They might say you're sleeping your way to the top, or that I'm having a midlife crisis. Let them talk," Emily said with more courage than she felt. Dinner was forgotten as Robert leaned in to kiss her. Unlike the urgent kisses from the night before, this was slow, deliberate. His hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. Emily's fingers gripped his sweater, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the soft fabric. When his lips moved to her neck, Emily gasped. His touch was confident, knowing exactly how to make her respond. Her hands found their way under his sweater, feeling the surprising firmness of his stomach, the light dusting of hair on his chest. "Emily," he whispered against her skin. "We should slow down." But Emily didn't want to slow down. She had been thinking about him for weeks now. She stood, taking his hand and pulling him up with her. "Where's your bedroom?" Robert's eyes darkened. Without a word, he led her up a staircase to a large room with a 4-poster bed. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, casting everything in silver light. They undressed each other slowly, each reveal a new discovery. Emily was surprised by how fit Robert was for his age. Broad shoulders, strong arms, only a slight softening around his middle. His hands trembled slightly as they slipped her dress from her shoulders. "You're beautiful," he said, voice rough with desire. Emily had worried the age difference would feel strange when they were naked together, but it didn't. His body told stories hers didn't yet. A scar on his side from an appendectomy, the slight salt and pepper hair on his chest, the confidence of his touch. But the way they fit together felt right, as if their bodies recognized something their minds were still figuring out. The morning sun streamed through Robert's bedroom windows, waking Emily gently. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then she felt the warm weight of Robert's arm around her waist, his breath steady against her neck. Last night hadn't been a dream. She carefully turned to look at him. In sleep, the lines on his face softened, making him appear more vulnerable than the powerful publisher she knew at the office. His silver hair was tousled, and Emily resisted the urge to run her fingers through it. As if sensing her gaze, Robert's eyes opened. For a brief second, confusion crossed his face, then recognition and warmth. "Good morning," he said, voice raspy with sleep. "Morning," Emily replied, suddenly shy despite their intimacy the night before. Robert's hand caressed her cheek. "No regrets in the daylight?" Emily shook her head. "None." He smiled, then glanced at the clock and sighed. "We should get ready for work." Separately. The reality of their situation came flooding back. They couldn't arrive together. People would notice. "I'll go first," Emily said, reluctantly leaving the warmth of his bed. After a quick shower, Emily borrowed one of Robert's shirts to wear over her dress from last night. As she was about to leave, Robert pulled her into a deep kiss. "Dinner tonight?" he asked. "I'd like that." For the next few weeks, they fell into a careful pattern. At the office, they maintained a strictly professional relationship. Robert was actually harder on Emily than before, sending back her work with more revisions, challenging her ideas in meetings. No one could accuse him of favoritism. But after hours, they were inseparable. Some nights they went to Robert's home, others to Emily's much smaller apartment, which Robert claimed he found charming. They cooked together, watched old films Robert loved, talked for hours about books and dreams and fears. The physical side of their relationship deepened too. Robert was a considerate lover, sometimes taking control of the confidence that made Emily weak in the knees, other times letting her set the pace. In bed, the age difference between them seemed to disappear completely. One evening, as they lay together on Robert's couch, Emily's head in his lap as he read aloud from a manuscript, his phone rang. He glanced at it and frowned. "I should take this. It's Mark from the board." Emily sat up, and Robert moved to his study. She couldn't hear his words, but his tone changed from warm to formal in an instant. When he returned, his expression was troubled. "What's wrong?" Emily asked. Robert sat heavily beside her. "Mark was calling to give me a heads up. There are rumors about us at the office." Emily felt her stomach drop. "What did he say?" "He's an old friend. He wanted to warn me that Jennifer in marketing overheard us in my office last week. Nothing explicit, but enough to start people talking." "What do we do?" Emily asked, her mind racing. She loved her job, had worked so hard to get where she was. Would everyone now think she'd slept her way into Robert's good graces? Robert took her hand. "We have options. We could deny everything, keep things even more private. Or," he hesitated, "or we could go public. Disclose our relationship to HR. It would mean one of us might need to transfer departments, but we wouldn't have to hide." "Would that hurt your position? You've built your career over decades." Robert smiled sadly. "At my age, Emily, I've learned what matters, and it isn't what the board thinks of me." Emily felt tears in her eyes. No man had ever put her before his career. "There's a third option," she said quietly. "We could end this now, before it damages either of us professionally." Robert's hand tightened on hers. "Is that what you want?" Emily looked at him. This man who had come into her life so unexpectedly, who challenged her, respected her, desired her. "No," she whispered. "It's not what I want at all." He pulled her into his arms, his kiss desperate and hungry, as if he needed to convince himself she was really choosing him. Emily responded with equal passion, her hands tangling in his hair, pressing herself against him. They made love right there on the couch, with an urgency born of the knowledge that they were choosing each other despite the risks. Robert whispered her name like a prayer, and when they finally lay exhausted in each other's arms, Emily knew there was no going back. "We'll talk to HR tomorrow," Robert said, stroking her hair. "Together." Emily nodded against his chest. Whatever came next, the gossip, the potential career complications, the raised eyebrows at their age difference, they would face it together. She had found something rare with Robert, something worth fighting for. As she drifted off to sleep in his arms, Emily realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't just making a safe choice. She was following her heart, consequences be damned. The meeting with HR was everything Emily had feared. The HR director, a woman named Patricia with steel gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, listened with an impassive face as Robert explained their relationship. Emily sat beside him, hands clenched tightly in her lap, feeling like a teenager called to the principal's office. So you're telling me, Patricia said when Robert finished, that this relationship began after Ms. Watson was hired, is completely consensual, and that you've maintained professional boundaries in the workplace. Yes, Robert replied firmly. Emily's work and promotions have been and will continue to be based solely on her merits. Patricia turned to Emily, and you feel the same way? No pressure or coercion. Absolutely, Emily said. I understand how this looks, but what's between us is real. Patricia sighed, removing her glasses. Robert, you know the company policy. One of you will need to transfer departments. Given your position and tenure, it makes more sense for Ms. Watson to move. I understand, Emily said quickly. I'm willing to transfer. Robert looked at her with gratitude in his eyes, reaching for her hand and squeezing it. I'll need paperwork from both of you, Patricia continued, and there will be a review to ensure there was no favoritism in Ms. Watson's hiring or subsequent assignments. She gave Robert a pointed look. The board will need to be informed. They left the HR office with mixed feelings. Their relationship was now official, but the real challenges were just beginning. Word spread quickly through the office. Emily felt eyes on her everywhere she went. Some colleagues were openly cold, others awkwardly supportive. The worst was Jennifer from marketing, who made a point of loudly discussing workplace ethics whenever Emily was nearby. Emily was transferred to the young adult division, working under a woman named Grace who had been with the company for 20 years. To Emily's relief, Grace treated her with professional respect, making it clear that she didn't care about office gossip as long as Emily did her job well. Robert had it worse. Emily heard through office whispers that several board members were questioning his judgment. There was talk of forcing him into early retirement. One evening, Emily arrived at Robert's house to find him sitting in his darkened living room, a glass of whiskey in hand. The board meeting didn't go well, he said without preamble. Emily sat beside him, taking his free hand. Tell me. They didn't ask me to resign, not yet, but James made it clear that any further lapses in judgment would be grounds for dismissal. He took a long sip of his drink. 30 years I've given to that company, built it from a mid-tier publisher to one of the top 5, and now they're treating me like I've committed some kind of crime. Emily felt guilt wash over her. This is because of me. Maybe we should. Don't, Robert interrupted sharply. Don't even suggest it. He set down his glass and turned to face her. Emily, I've spent my life making safe choices, building a career, maintaining appearances, and yes, I'm proud of what I've accomplished. But meeting you? He touched her face gently. For the first time in decades, I'm living, not just existing. Emily leaned into his touch, tears welling in her eyes. I don't want to cost you everything you've worked for. You're not. He kissed her softly. You're giving me something more valuable. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Robert propped himself on his elbow, looking down at her with a strange expression. What? Emily asked, suddenly self-conscious. I was just thinking, he said, tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. When I was your age, my whole life was about climbing the ladder. I missed so much, travel I put off, books I never wrote, relationships I let fade away. His hand stilled on her skin. I don't want that for you. What are you saying? I'm saying that whatever happens with our jobs, I don't want you to compromise your dreams. You're brilliant, Emily. You have a future in publishing that could outshine mine, or maybe you'll write your own books one day. I just want to be there to see it. Emily felt her heart swell. This man, who had achieved everything she aspired to professionally, was thinking not of himself but of her potential. She pulled him down into a kiss that quickly deepened, their bodies coming together with a familiar yet always exciting rhythm. The morning light filtered through the curtains as Emily prepared coffee in Robert's kitchen. She had spent most of the night thinking about her plan, refining it, gathering courage to share it. When Robert appeared, hair still damp from his shower, she handed him a mug and took a deep breath. I have an idea, she said. About our situation. Robert raised an eyebrow, sitting at the kitchen island. I'm listening. What if we started our own publishing house? The words tumbled out quickly. A small, independent press. You have the experience, the connections. I have new ideas, energy. Together we could build something that's ours. Robert stared at her, surprise evident on his face. That's a significant undertaking. I know, Emily said, sitting beside him. But think about it. You've been talking about how corporate publishing is losing its soul, focusing on guaranteed bestsellers instead of nurturing new voices. We could do it differently. Robert was quiet for a long moment, and Emily feared she had overstepped. Then he reached for her hand. Where would we get the capital? A new publishing house needs significant investment. You mentioned you've been saving for retirement, and I have some money from my grandmother. Emily squeezed his hand. It's risky, I know, but isn't it better than watching the board push you out or seeing me stuck in a department I don't care about just to avoid a conflict of interest? A slow smile spread across Robert's face. You're serious about this? Completely. Robert pulled her into his arms, kissing her with an intensity that left her breathless. Emily Watson, he said when they finally broke apart, you continue to surprise me. Is that a yes? It's a let's seriously consider this. He looked younger suddenly, energized. I have some calls to make. Over the next few weeks, their evenings were spent huddled over Robert's dining table, surrounded by business plans, financial projections, and lists of potential authors. They argued sometimes, Robert more cautious, Emily more ambitious, but each disagreement ended with a deeper understanding of the other's perspective. The physical side of their relationship intensified during this time. There was something intoxicating about building dreams together that carried over into their intimate moments. One night, after a particularly productive planning session, Robert lifted Emily onto the dining table, scattering papers everywhere as he kissed his way down her body. She tangled her fingers in his silver hair, gasping as his mouth found the sensitive spots he had come to know so well. Later, lying tangled together on the living room floor where they had ended up, Emily traced the lines of Robert's face. Do you ever worry about the age difference? She asked softly. Not now, but in the future. Robert's eyes were serious as he covered her hand with his. I worry that I'm being selfish, yes. That I'm taking years from you that you could spend with someone who will be with you longer. That's not what I asked, Emily said. I'm choosing this, choosing you, with open eyes. Then yes, I worry. I worry that I won't keep up with you. That I'll become a burden. He kissed her palm. But I also believe that whatever time we have, whether it's years or decades, will be worth it. The next day, Emily arrived at work to find an email requesting her presence in the main conference room. When she arrived, Robert was there, along with Patricia from HR and 2 board members. Ms. Watson, one of the board members said, his tone cold. It's come to our attention that you and Mr. Thompson are planning to start a competing publishing house while still employed here. We consider this a serious breach of your contracts. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Someone had been watching them or monitoring their emails. We've had private discussions, Robert said calmly. Nothing has been decided. Nevertheless, the board member continued, the board has decided to terminate both your employments, effective immediately. Emily's heart raced. Everything was happening too fast. She looked at Robert, expecting to see anger or fear, but instead found him looking almost relieved. As they were escorted to their offices to collect their personal items, Robert managed to whisper to her, "Meet me at home. This might be the push we needed." 2 hours later, Emily arrived at Robert's house with a box of her office belongings. She found him in the garden, opening a bottle of champagne. You're celebrating? She asked incredulously. 1 year later, Emily stood in the doorway of their small but elegant office space, watching Robert as he carefully arranged books on the shelves behind his desk. Each spine represented a victory, the 12 titles that Thompson and Watson Publishing had released in their first year of operation. The journey hadn't been easy. Robert's lawyer had successfully argued against the non-compete clauses, but they'd still faced numerous obstacles. Finding investors had been challenging until one of Robert's oldest friends, a successful author he'd published 20 years ago, decided to back them. Even then, they'd had to start smaller than Emily had envisioned, working from Robert's home for the first 6 months. But what they lacked in resources, they made up for in dedication and industry knowledge. Robert's reputation had opened doors, and several authors had followed him from Parker Publishing. Emily's fresh perspective on marketing had helped them reach younger readers, building a social media presence that larger publishers envied. Admiring the view? Robert asked without turning around, somehow sensing her presence. Always, Emily replied, smiling as she walked toward him. She slipped her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against his back. The Times Review came in. Julia's novel got a full page. They're calling it a remarkable debut from a promising new voice, discovered by the most exciting new press in years. Robert turned in her arms, his face bright with pride. That's the third glowing review this month. And the sales numbers are following, Emily said. The first print run is almost sold out. Robert pulled her closer, kissing her forehead. You know what this means? We can finally afford to hire that editorial assistant you've been wanting. Emily laughed. Thank goodness. I was beginning to think we'd be working 16-hour days forever. Would that be so terrible? Robert asked, his voice dropping lower as his hands slid down to her hips. Being trapped in an office with me day and night? Terrible, Emily teased, lifting her face for a kiss that quickly deepened. This was another thing that hadn't changed in the past year. The desire between them remained as strong as ever. If anything, building their business together had only strengthened their connection. There was something powerfully intimate about watching a dream take shape under their combined efforts. We should lock the door, Emily murmured against his lips as his hands began to wander. Already did, Robert replied with a mischievous smile that made him look years younger. When I saw you standing there looking so proud and beautiful, I had a feeling we might need some privacy. Later, as they straightened their clothes and Emily tried to fix her disheveled hair, the office phone rang. Robert answered, his professional voice betraying none of what had just happened on his desk. Yes, Ms. Reynolds, he said. We received your manuscript and Emily is reviewing it this week. He paused, listening. Yes, we are a small team, but that means your work gets our full attention. Another pause. We'd be delighted to meet with you next Tuesday. After hanging up, Robert turned to Emily with a gleam in his eye. Another potential author. Her agent says she's been disappointed with how her last publisher marketed her work. I've read her previous novels, Emily said excitedly. She's brilliant, but they've been packaging her all wrong, trying to force her into the thriller category when her work is much more nuanced. Robert shook his head, smiling fondly at her enthusiasm. This is why we work, you know. You see possibilities where others see categories. You're changing how this industry thinks. Emily felt a flush of pleasure at his praise. We're changing it together. That evening, they walked hand in hand from their office to a small restaurant where they had reservations. It was their anniversary, 1 year since the day they'd been fired and decided to start their own company. The restaurant was intimate, with soft lighting and a quiet corner table waiting for them. As they settled in, Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. I have something for you, he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. It's not exactly traditional, but then neither are we. Emily opened the box to find a key with a small silver pendant attached to it. It's a key to a cottage in Vermont, Robert explained. A writing retreat, for us, whenever we need to escape the city. But it's also, he took her hand, it's also my way of saying I want to build a future with you, Emily, not just a business, a life. Emily felt tears in her eyes as she squeezed his hand. Are you asking me to move in with you? Because I practically live at your place already. I'm asking for more than that, Robert said softly. I'm asking if you'll consider making it permanent. Making us permanent. Emily leaned across the table and kissed him, not caring who saw them. Yes, she whispered against his lips. To everything, yes. As they celebrated with champagne, Emily looked at Robert across the table, this man who had once been her intimidating boss, who had become her lover, her partner, and now wanted to be her future. She thought about the path that had brought them here, with all its complications and risks and rewards. Behind closed doors, her 60-year-old boss had done something unexpected. He had shown her that life's greatest adventures often begin when you have the courage to follow your heart.